Buenas tardes. For everyone here in the room, welcome to Migration Policy Institute. Everyone on the webcast, welcome to Migration Policy Institute as well. And to El Colegio de Mexico, you can be at both if you're on the web. We are immensely pleased today to be co-sponsoring the event with El Colegio de Mexico. You'll hear from the president of El Colegio de Mexico, Silvia Giorguli, in a moment, Dr. Silvia Giorguli. Recently, you have seen, unless you've been under a rock somewhere, you have seen lots and lots of stories about the U.S. Mexico border. They have been constant, and the tone of many of them have been, we are returning to the past. The things are going back to where they were 10 years ago. That actually couldn't be further from the truth. Things are actually quite different than they were 10 years ago, and they're different than they were 5 years ago. One of the things that we have done between MPI and Colegio de Mexico is convene over the past few months, long before a lot of this attention was at the border. There was already attention, but the most recent round was a group of people from Mexico and the United States to talk about U.S. Mexico migration. Not just migrants from Mexico and the United States, but the entire realm of migration that goes on between the two countries and how we manage this. And it is one of the things that has been, I think, surprising for many of us, including many of us that have been in these discussions for years, is finding how much things have actually changed in the past few years. When we were having conversations about U.S. Mexico migration 10 years ago, we were talking still primarily about Mexicans moving to the United States and a large population, mostly unauthorized, of Mexicans living in the United States. There is still a large population of Mexicans in the United States, but most of that movement, that number of Mexicans in the United States has actually gone down slightly in recent years. Many Mexicans continue to arrive, mostly through legal pathways, but the number has actually gone down because many Mexicans have returned to Mexico. At the same time, you have a growing community of Americans living in Mexico as well, a number that could be anywhere from where INEGI, the Mexican Census Service, puts it around 732,000, but it may be as high as 1.5, 1.8 million. It's a large number of American-born people living in Mexico. That is new. Probably in net numbers, we're talking about an increase of Americans in Mexico still, while we have a decrease of Mexicans in the United States. Figure that. We would not have talked about that 5 or 10 years ago. We also are, however, we do have new flows, and these flows aren't completely new, but they're new in their intensity, which are flows from Central America, primarily Honduras and Guatemala. These have been the subject of much of the headlines, and there are enormous questions about how each country wants to handle these flows and how they see this. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this. We will talk about the range of issues between the U.S. and Mexico in today's event, but this is obviously a centerpiece for conversations going on between the two governments and between people across the border today. We're going to talk about whether cooperation is possible. There are distinct visions in Mexico and the U.S. how we handle migration. What is the mix of enforcement and how you do enforcement? How do you deal with asylum policies, which is an issue you'll hear from, is a huge issue both in Mexico and the United States. What other legal pathways are available for migrants, and how you invest in root causes and to what extent and in what way. These are all issues that are in debate. These are all issues in which the current debate is conflictive in some ways, but where there are long-term possibilities of convergence as well. We have titled today's event, Is U.S.-Mexico Cooperation on Migration Possible? You can tweet questions to @migrationpolicy. You can use the hashtag MPIDiscuss, or you can email events@migrationpolicy.org. Or if you're in the room, you can raise your hand when the time is for questions and answers. We're grateful for Western Union and Mario Hernandez, our colleague, who I think is here somewhere, for supporting this. Mario, thank you for your support, as well as for Rossini, which has supported this event and the working group as well. And I'm immensely pleased to introduce Silvia Giorguli, president of El Colegio de Mexico. Silvia, great to have you here at MPI. Oh, yes, you.
Thank you. Well, good evening. It's a pleasure for me to be here. So, as Andrew has said, international migration is today at the center of the debate globally, not only in Mexico and the US, but at the international level. But this debate is occurring within a very adverse scenario where it's difficult to isolate the discussion around the management of migration, given the political use of migration, especially during electoral processes. I think that within this context, what we need is to bring in evidence to inform the debate, experience. We have had a long time relation around migration issues between Mexico and the US, and I think there are lessons to be learned and recovered for the current scenario from that experience. And we need to bring in binational, multinational reflections in search of an effective migration policies or management of migration. And that's what we seek from this collaboration between the Migration Policy Institute and El Colegio de Mexico. Something that we have learned in the new scenario is that there are many things that Mexico and the US share. No, we share a large population of dual citizens. We share a population of American-born people that is moving to Mexico, as Andrew already mentioned. And we also share now this context of managing the flows of from different countries, mainly but from Central America to Mexico and the US. So within this new scenario, I think there's a space and the need for U.S. Mexico cooperation on the management of these flows and the discussion. We have similar challenges. One of the questions is to what extent governments see the gains of this cooperation. I'm not sure that they see them. And probably one of the reasons is the differences in the concepts and interest around the management of migration. In the case of Mexico, this discussion is occurring when we have what we can still call a new government. That has been in the discourse very assertive in pushing a human rights-centered approach around migration, that is facing challenges towards the construction of a coherent and comprehensive migration system policy, and that we have to face in the next months issues such as the definition of the goals of the migration policy, deterrence management, something that Doris Meissner mentioned today, also how to build a healthy system that considers different paths to entry into Mexico, asylum seeking, labor-based migration, family reunification, the management of regional temporary moves, and the challenge of building an institutional framework that responds in terms of financial resources and human resources to these challenges. And all these, again, occurring within a very adverse scenario. Given the adverse scenario and the size of the challenges, I think that we, in terms of what we can do in a study group and a collaboration like this, we have to be persistent. The Migration Policy Institute and El Colegio de Mexico intend to collaborate with an evidence-based debate to recover lessons from the past and to push the central idea that global and multinational issues such as migration need transnational responses and transnational discussions. I'm looking forward to the discussion today with the certainty that we will not finish it today, that it's part of an ongoing discussion. And thank you again to Andrew Seeley, to the Migration Policy Institute, and to Mario Hernandez and Western Union, which facilitated this dialogue. And I will now give the mic to Claudia Masferrer.
Thank you, Silvia. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today at MPI, and I'm sure that we're going to have a very interesting discussion, very lively. We're going to have time for questions, but for a while. I would like to start with some questions. And I think the title of the talk today is really clear and has some assumptions. And it's is U.S. Mexico cooperation on migration possible? So it kind of assumes that it is not, that we are in a context where cooperation is not possible, right? Now it also assumes that we need cooperation. It assumes that it's needed, and I guess something that we discussed today and we are all aware, and I guess we all agree, is that migration is a binational, transnational, international, global phenomenon that does not need and cannot be dealt with unilaterally. But still, with the question, if cooperation is possible, we have the assumption that it has been a unilateral national approach and that we need something to change about it, right? So my first question would be, why do we think that it's not possible? And I don't know who wants to jump in first, but why are we under the assumption that we need to discuss this? Carlos.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Carlos Heredia, professor at CIDE. I think it's not possible because we have totally different definitions of what we're talking about. President Donald Trump says that Mexico does not cooperate, not stop enough Central American migrants moving northward. And So that's a different definition of cooperation as we see it. And also, if we're talking about the situation in Central America, and we talk about development defined as enabling people to generate value and having a better livelihood. And he is probably thinking as a real estate developer. So we're talking about altogether different definitions.
Alan, let me go back to you. Let me go to you because you have been.
So Carlos, it may not be possible that how has it happened for the last 25 years? When in fact, since TLSA, NAFTA, and the growth of a shared production platform between our countries, the increase of our trade from $80 billion to just under $700 billion, we actually had a regime of cooperation that was very close, that articulated theories of action for joint management of the border. We exchange to this day more information than would have been thought possible a generation ago. So I hear you on the political dimensions of the current moment, both in Mexico, where we have a left-oriented populism, and here in the United States, where we have a right-oriented populism. But the fact of the matter is, in the same way that the president could not scrap NAFTA, in fact, there are grounds for cooperation because the facts on the ground, the number of Mexicans in our country, the number of Americans, as Andrew points out, in Mexico, the sheer volume of economic activity, $1 million a second, means that not only is it indispensable, but we have to continuously work to implement it.
Now, there has been a long-standing cooperation between the two countries, and I would like you, Roberta, to highlight those examples or case studies where cooperation was successful.
Well, I would start out, thank you, Claudia, and thank you to Andrew and to Silvia for this day, which was remarkable with all of these experts. I think one of the things I would highlight is that cooperation is most effective when it is indeed based on shared responsibility, and I think that's what the basis has been for a very long time. I also think that some of the examples that we have are struggling but probably continuing, and that is information exchange. Information exchange is crucial in this. All of the governments involved, not just U.S. and Mexico, but Central American countries, have got to share data, share information, or nobody can have a clear picture of the migration flows. But I also think that the examples of cooperation in the past, as difficult as it was, and we still haven't figured out exactly the reasons for a certain amount of success, but when you look at the unaccompanied children crisis of 2014, and I was intimately involved in that both here in Washington and then subsequently later afterwards in Mexico, we looked at a huge number of factors and sat down with our Mexican counterparts to talk about what we could do together, working with countries of the Northern Triangle. And it did make a difference in the end, because the more you cooperate based on shared responsibility, there is a multiplier effect in your ability to get things done. So I do think that that is essential to cooperation, and that's not necessarily happening at this point. There's not necessarily the public assertion of shared responsibility that there was previously. I also think that we operated under a premise of no surprises, which has changed fairly radically in the last few years.
Both sides.
So let me catch up that what you talked about, the 2014 unaccompanied children crisis. Because when you go back to what has happening in Central America, you can really think that migration started in the 90s, in the 80s, in the 70s, depends on the country, depends on the context. It was motivated by political instability, by insecurity, but social unrest. And to what extent we are living a different context right now, and what is different. And I'm just thinking about, I mean, Doris has written a lot about asylum, and I want to move towards asylum, because if you think of what happened in 2014, The flow was not new. What was different was the characteristic. But somehow, this opened up the door to start looking at what was happening with children and the flows that have been coming to the United States for many, many years, but that somehow went out of the attention for many.
So thank you very much, and thanks all for being here. I would endorse what we said. We've had quite a discussion today. Among the things, though, that comes out of what you're talking about and what we're grappling with in terms of both of our countries, I think, is that what has been really a 40-year-long flow from Mexico to the United States of single young men looking for work in the United States and in the process of doing so trying to avoid enforcement and avoid the Border Patrol to get into the country changed in the teens, from about 2012, 2013, 2014 on. And that change in the flow really brought the border to the point where most reasonable people would have to agree that the border was under control. That by about 2014, we actually had reasonable border security and border control. That's been a decades-long project, which has been funded by both Republican and Democratic administrations, Republican and Democratic Congresses. It's a major achievement, and we never have been able to really solidify that in the eyes of the American people, many of the American people, and certainly not with what then began as the surge of young people coming in 2014 and the difficulty of handling that and the longer term effects of it, which are that a whole new flow began to set in. And that whole new flow, of which you could say the vanguard was the child migrant crisis in 2014, is now what has taken over. However, we have not adjusted. We've not adjusted our border enforcement activities, our border enforcement infrastructure, nor have we invested in the parts of our system, our immigration system, that are equipped to handle it. And that part of the immigration system that we haven't invested in is the asylum process, both at USCIS and the immigration judge system at the Department of Justice, so that by the time we came to these sorts of numbers and a new administration coming in that saw migration very differently, we are now right back into a discussion of the borders not being in control, of the need for greater border security, which is actually not what the problem is on the ground. The problem on the ground is an emergency. The problem on the ground is definitely very large numbers that are overwhelming our enforcement personnel at the present time. But the answer is in making decisions on those cases and recognizing that we have a different flow that is enduring and it requires different answers from the Mexican migration.
Gustavo.
Doris' view, for Mexico, it's also an unprecedented situation because we have had Central Americans crossing Mexico to get into the US for decades. But there were small groups or individuals. But we have never faced groups of 5,000, 2,000, 100 people traveling together, not to stay in Mexico, but trying to reach the border with the US. And that creates a lot of demands on the capacities and institutional abilities of Mexico to stop these flows with no force, but to respect basically their human rights. And that in the new administration in Mexico has created a dilemma of what type of role should Mexico play with these new flows in this type of group of people traveling through Mexico. And it is not an easy task. Mexico, as you know, is a big country, and there are a lot of ways to get through. And therefore, you have criminality that would like to attack and to abuse of these people, that you have to protect them while they are in territory, in Mexican territory. And now we have been asked by the US to receive some of them in Mexico while they are being processed to see if they have the right to receive refugee. All of that is an effort not recognized still by the U.S. government. If we go to the numbers, I can tell you that we have stopped and returned Central Americans for the last 5-8 years in the hundreds of thousands of people, each one of them trying to reach the U.S. So indirectly, because we enforce our immigration laws, we alleviate the pressure of these people reaching the U.S. border and getting into the U.S. So that is a fact, that is a number, and part of what makes complicated negotiating now with the U.S. administration is that there is no recognition of this reciprocity needed to deal and manage better these new realities for both countries.
But Gustavo, let me just jump in, because when you look at the data for the last 20 years, Mexico has deported more Central Americans than the U.S., right? The trend goes back and forth, and sometimes, some years it's the U.S., sometimes it's Mexico, but there's still the idea that Mexico is doing nothing to send back Central American migrants that arrive to Mexico. But this is not true, right? But still there is this impression that Mexico is not deporting. And I mean, maybe one solution, and I'm going to be ironic here, is to tell Central Americans to go back to the old model and just arrive alone, right? The attention that was put in the caravans has been detrimental for everyone, because it has increased the political climate, the tensions. It has increased the attention to them, pressure in the border in Tijuana and in other cities that have been used to actually welcoming all these migrants. So is this a very naive solution?
Part of the problem is that the new administration, remember, we had a complete change in administration in Mexico. So what had been an ongoing policy of cooperation, as you see in the change of any administration in this country or in Mexico, there was a period in which there was not the enforcement that had been taking place, although it's now been resumed. The difficulty is that the push factors out of Central America, out of the Northern Triangle, have become accentuated. Poverty, violence, lack of opportunity, the desire to reunite children with families. But the pull factor is not the usual job market, although in this economy that's now become a factor as well. The pull factor right now is the broken asylum system, or the overwhelmed asylum system that Doris referred to. The truth of the matter is that if the reason why the argument about the big, massive wall from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific is so irrelevant is that people who are coming from Central America today are not trying to avoid Border Patrol agents, ladies and gentlemen. They're actually trying to find Border Patrol agents so that they can assert asylum. And the difficulty with an overwhelmed asylum system is that if you claim asylum, you're subjected to a credible fear test that is a relatively low threshold examination. 80+% of the people pass that test. And what happens then is you're assigned an immigration court hearing at which your full petition for asylum will be adjudicated. But because of the backlog in the immigration courts, those hearings are 2, 3, 4 years ahead. And in the meantime, people are paroled, they're able to enter the United States, and they spend years in the United States. The asylum system is not the vehicle by which we should be permitting people, for reasons of labor mobility or reasons of work or school. The asylum system is neither calculated to redress every human misfortune in the Northern Triangle or elsewhere in the world, and it's not intended to be the vehicle by which immigrants come into the country. And one of the tragedies of the current situation is that the people who really need asylum, the people who really do need protection, increasingly cannot be distinguished from the large number of economic migrants who, I don't begrudge them taking advantage of an overwhelmed system, but this is not a system that we can long abide by. And I think what I heard Gustavo saying and Roberta saying before, and Doris, is that we need to cooperate on the asylum issues as well, not just the enforcement issues, but on the asylum issues that are now facing both countries.
Andres, you wanted to jump in earlier. Sorry.
Well, maybe going back, and first of all, thank you to MPI and to Colegio de Mexico. It's nice to be back in this room where I sat from the time MPI was founded as a member of the board. Um, Thank you. I want to go back to your original title of this talk, and that is cooperation possible, bilateral cooperation? It's more difficult maybe at this particular moment in time, but it's also been difficult historically. Throughout the 40 plus years that I've had to do with the bilateral relationship, we've had ups and downs on the issue of discussing migration. And the fact is that today, because of these changes that several of you have mentioned, the fact that we're now talking more about migration from third countries rather than Mexican migration to the United States makes it even more difficult because there are more actors involved. The patterns have changed. But I would rephrase the question rather than can we cooperate to we need to cooperate. I think there is a clear mandate to both of our governments that we need to cooperate on this because it's a bilateral issue, and it's also it goes beyond bilateral. It's a third country phenomenon as well. In Mexico now we are getting, in addition to Central Americans, and in addition to the Haitians, which we've had for quite some time, and in addition to the Cubans that we've had for quite some time, we now have Africans and we have Asians who are using Mexico as a launching pad to try to get to the United States. And of course, it's more difficult today to come into the United States than it's been traditionally because of the enforcement, because of the additional resources that the U.S. government has put at the border and at the Border Patrol and so on. So it's a very complex phenomenon, and I think it's one that we've had the great opportunity to discuss over the years here at MPI and in other fora. But what we really need, I think, to do, and this is where perhaps a criticism to the way in which the United States deals with this today, the United States government, is that we need to tone down the rhetoric. If you continue to badmouth immigrants, if you continue to talk about immigrants as threats to national security, if you continue to use words like emergency and things like that, at the end of the day, you spend a lot of time creating an image of a phenomenon that has existed, I won't say for decades, it's existed for centuries. And at the end of the day, what you do is you give public opinion an enormous ability to see this phenomenon in only negative terms and not in any of the positive terms. And there are lots of positive terms. I mean, this country is a country which has been built on immigration. And immigrants have contributed to this country forever, from the time of independence. After all of the people who declared independence were immigrants. So if the rhetoric ends up driving this phenomenon and driving public opinion, you, at the end of the day, are shooting yourself in the foot, basically.
So having accepted that we need cooperation, my first question would be, how do we cooperate? And I mean, Carlos, what would the new administration in Mexico try to attempt in this cooperation?
Well, first of all, cooperation means working together. Let's remember that. So, I mean, the message we got from minute one from the Trump administration is I want to build a wall between our two countries. So that's not working together. I mean, in sharp contrast with that, the message we've been getting from plenty of Americans throughout the 50 states is we want to work with Mexico. I mean, the state of California has sent plenty of delegations conveying exactly that message. And we, over a discussion this morning, we were talking about examples in Andrew's book, Vanishing Frontiers. and as far up north as Ohio and Pennsylvania, whole communities that are revitalized by immigrant labor. So it depends. Cooperation for what? Working together for what? Or not working together? So again, it's a matter of how do you find things. I mean, even a few days back at the CEO dialogue in Merida, President Trump had said, we're full. And the president of the Chamber of Commerce of the United States said, we need more workers.
Roberta.
Things I was going to say is Doris raised something in our conversations earlier today that I think was really important. I always listen to what Doris says, but this was critical at this moment. She talked about prior moments in our bilateral relationship on migration, an issue which I think has been difficult for both countries for a long time. But she talked about having the space and the time, I think, to deal with the migration issues. I think that's critical. Most of all, those conversations should be technical, they should be held by experts, and they should be sort of discreet, at least in the initial conversations. And in a way, what we have now is the opposite. Everything is in public, everything is political, and there's not much expertise brought to bear. And so we long for the luxury to make policy together out of the glare of public or media attention and political polarization that we're in right now. And I think there was a general sense that results in both greater cooperation that's politically sustainable for each country, and one hopes better policy.
So we need to cooperate in many different aspects, right? We have to cooperate on asylum, on refugee processes, managing transit, managing borders, some border enforcement. We need labor mobility. We need family reunification. We also need maybe temporary workers programs. So we need to cooperate in many different aspects. If you would have to prioritize, or just from today, if you want to have like, where should we start cooperating? Again, on the private, so that no one else puts the attention in there and the media is not, so what are how have you cooperated or not? Where should we start?
Yep. The problem is, which is the asylum system is not functioning, and the idea that Mexico needs to develop as now the 13th largest economy in the world, and the OECD projects that it's going to be the 5th largest economy within one generation. Mexico is transitioning, as Doris pointed out, from being a sending country to being a transit country and a receiving country. It needs to be able to develop an asylum system, a refugee system that can, fits a great nation, can actually handle that. At the same time, at least in the short term, the United States needs to be able to put an end to the overwhelming of the system that permits people to come up and utilize the asylum system for purposes for which it was never designed. And we cannot handle that without cooperation in Mexico, without the creation of some kind of safe zones, without some kind of the ability to handle the humanitarian crisis. You can't just do what we're frankly doing and have been doing, is in effect dump people over in Mexico without providing any assistance for humanitarian care of the people who are being asked to wait for their petitions to be adjudicated and to do so in Mexico. So I think the first area, actually, Claudia, that we need to impress, not necessarily by a value proposition, it's by the necessity of the current crisis that requires that to be a focus, in my view, of the cooperation at this point. But we can walk and chew gum at the same time. There are lots of areas of cooperation. The ongoing movement of trade across the Mexico-U.S. border is actually a tribute to the fact that there's plenty of cooperation in those 46 ports of entry handling the $600+ billion in trade. So I would start with there, but I would continue emphasizing what Andre said, which is you can't manage the border unilaterally. You have to do it bilaterally.
Before going really quickly to Andres, is this a humanitarian crisis, a refugee crisis, a border crisis, a political crisis? What is it, Andres?
All of the above. But I want to just quickly refer to what Alan has just said. I agree, and I don't think anybody can disagree with the fact that the asylum system in the U.S. isn't working, but neither is the immigration system working. And it's not just on the issue of asylum. I mean, the U.S. immigration system, by all definitions, by Americans, is that it's broken and that it's been broken for a long time. And if you were able to emigrate to the United States legally in a way in which you could fill a job that was required or unify with your family or other ways of entering the United States legally, you would, first of all, have much less of an issue of people coming in without papers, without documents. And at the same time, you would be able to fill the need that Tom Donahue and others have been talking about in terms of labor deficits. The problem is that you can't. And this is an issue which very many Americans, especially outside of Washington, find difficult to understand because they say, well, why don't you all come legally? You say, well, we'd love to come legally. The problem is it takes 25 years sometimes to put yourself in the line, in the queue, to be able to come in. And with the asylum system, it's equally bad because you have to probably wait at least 1, maybe 2, 3, 4 years. Now, the question is, how can you expect Mexico to take on these people, mainly Central Americans who are today asking for asylum in the United States, to live on the Mexican side of the border for 3 years or 4 years, waiting to see when they will be called to have their cases adjudicated? It will not work. It has already created a backlash in Mexico against Central Americans. There are cities in Mexico at the border today where the local population has become tremendously anti-immigrant, which was never really the case in Mexico. So I don't think that the solution lies in the asylum per se, in the asylum issue per se. I think it runs all across the whole immigration structure in Mexico and in the United States. And we don't have much of an immigration system either in Mexico. I think it's first to say that for us, immigration has not been a major issue. I think that unlike the U.S., which has been very immigrant-friendly over its history, Mexico has not been very immigrant-friendly over its history. We've taken in immigrants during civil conflicts in different countries when there were the military dictatorships in South America, during the Spanish Civil War, during the Second World War with Eastern Europeans who fled Europe. But we are not an easy immigrant receptive country. It is not easy to emigrate into Mexico. So we both need to create a system. And the way to do that, I think, is cooperatively. But again, if the rhetoric continues to be what it is, what it's been for the last 3 years, since Mr. Trump came down the escalator of Trump Tower and called us rapists and criminals and all of that, we will find it very, very difficult to have and meet on common ground.
And also, in terms of the things that are facts and not misperceptions or open lies, cooperation on security, for example, since 9/11, Mexico and the U.S. have cooperated and continue to cooperate intensely in order to prevent either terrorism or even criminals to come to the U.S. the last flows of Central Americans, yes, probably there will be some bad apples there, but we have been with them, basically the vast majority of them are just families of normal, poor, desperate men, women, and children trying to get a better life and running from violence. Violence that, by the way, is caused, at least in Honduras and in a way in El Salvador, by gangs that were deported from the U.S. several years ago. So cooperation is not only dealing with the immigration flows of undocumented people, but also in this very sensitive issue of security. So when we hear that there are bad guys and that there are rapists and that there are people from extremist ideologies, at least we don't have that experience. We don't have that numbers. In these 18 years in 2001, we haven't got one incident of terrorism in Mexico coming to the US. And that has to do with a lot of intense, permanent, daily exchange of information that is not recognized today.
So we need to fix immigration system, and I like how you put it in terms of Mexico and the U.S. Mexico has traditionally been considered an immigration country, and we are facing now increase in return, increase in asylum. Transit is not new, I would say, but we need to figure out ways of managing different flows and mixed flows as well. So my question would be, how can Mexico design new immigration policy in the face of what's happening in the United States? Because we cannot disentangle that. So when López Obrador announced humanitarian visas or work permits for Central Americans, there was a lot of reactions in Mexico against these permits and visas. Because again, what you were saying, there is also an anti-immigrant sentiment in Mexico. So we have not been very good at welcoming returnees. We have not been very good welcoming immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees from different areas of the world. And when he suggests having work visas, there's also, a reaction against. So one question is, how do we change the narrative in Mexico? How do we change the narrative in the US? That can be harder. Maybe, there are examples of very successful immigrants that have integrated. The notion of being a nation of immigrants in Canada, the US is very well accepted. It's not in Mexico. How do we change the narrative in Mexico to be more open, more welcoming? But also, how do we create legal channels for people to migrate? And again, we have a different, I like to think of the immigration portfolio. We have temporary, permanent solutions. We have programs for family reunification, for work, for humanitarian reasons. So what can we do in Mexico in order to actually address all of these different flows and mixed flows coming from different areas, from the US, from Central America, from Africa, etc.?
I'll be very facetious on one thing, and that's if President López Obrador begins to employ undocumented Americans in in Palacio Nacional, we might be able to deal with this on a more even basis. I think you're right. There are a whole series of issues. I am always optimistic. I think one has to be optimistic in this world. It's difficult to be pessimistic because then you go out and shoot yourself. But the fact is that we need to begin to change the messages. President López Obrador is an ideological leftist. He believes strongly that one can solve this problem by developing and sending resources to Central America, to the south of Mexico and Central America, develop what has been a traditionally undeveloped area of our own country, but also within the northern triangle of Central America. And I think he's right. That's an important task. The U.S. hasn't seen it that way. I think although the speech has been fairly positive, actions have been contrary to that, suspension of aid to the Central American countries. and no new, fresh resources for development. So here you have the message from the White House that immigration is a threat. It's a threat to national security. It's an emergency. It's terrible. It's bad. And in Mexico, you have a president who says, well, immigration comes because we don't give enough attention to developing the south of Mexico and the northern part of Central America. And those two messages are very difficult to make compatible one with the other.
Well, Roberta.
I completely agree. And I think that one of the tough problems is that this is an incredibly complicated and nuanced issue. Policy prescriptions need to be nuanced. In the 140 or 220 character world that we live in, they get reduced to such caricatures that everyone is either wholly negative about migration, whether it's seeing it as a threat or saying we need to close the border and build a wall, or they're in favor of open borders and they want love and peace. And frankly, neither of those extremes is going to solve this problem. Andres is right that those are two very different ways of looking at migration, but in fact, the truth is both grayer and more complicated.
And more localized.
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, this is an issue which, the way I described it, is how it comes out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's not what the United States and Americans in general feel. And all the polling shows that the U.S. and American people believe that immigration is positive, not negative. But the message coming out from the government is that it's negative. And that's where you get a disconnect as well.
Carlos.
I think one change that we have to undertake in Mexico at the domestic level is to abandon the paradigm of trying to be competitive in the international markets through castigating, punishing wages, suppressing wages. For too long, we have relied on being competitive through suppressing wages. There's an initiating debate on labor reform in Mexico, and this is where the two issues connect, the trade issue and the migration issue. And some people prefer to say, oh, no, this is only due to pressure from US unions and Canadian unions. But we have a problem. We have a problem of miserable wages in Mexico that we have to deal with. 30 years ago, the debate was, oh, how can you allow the opposition to win a governorship at the border? It's against national security. And then it was also about how can you open up the economy? The Americans are going to overwhelm us, and the Japanese are going to take over. And now is, are we going to have free affiliation to labor unions? Are we going to have wages that are not suppressed to be competitive? So I prefer to talk about labor mobility, but in any event, we can no longer rely on, denying to Central Americans what we demand to Americans up north, because we have a double standard, and for too long we have been used to saying we demand that the labor rights of Mexican workers are respected in the U.S., but we give Central Americans a raw deal in Mexico.
The Mexican government has focused a lot of the discussion in human rights and development, and we talked today and discussed a lot the issue of development, and I'm just wondering if you can, comment a little bit on cooperation towards development, both in Mexico and in Central America, because it seems as it's one of the themes that at least it's under discussion. I don't know if it's possible or not, but what kind of projects and development projects should we need to cooperate in? Doris?
Let me start. I personally feel pretty ill-equipped, as I think all of us did in this discussion, to really understand what we mean about development and what we mean about what would work and be effective. We all know, as a starting point, that the response to this issue has to be a multifaceted response. It can't simply be enforcement. It can't simply be refugee and asylum systems. It can't simply be integration, good integration policies, et cetera. Somehow has to get to the source, to what the root causes are, to what is propelling this migration. But we also know that that is a very long-term response, that to simply respond with that is really to avoid the issue, even though that is definitely what some people do. But it has to be part of an equation. And so, you know, when one knows something about development, I mean, you know that ultimately the countries themselves have to first own that agenda. The countries themselves ultimately have to be committed to making changes in their own systems that have held them back. And it's not hard, with all due respect, to identify what are some of the things in these Northern Triangle countries that are serious problems. I mean, they still are very deeply entrenched power structures that are not amenable to addressing issues of inequality, addressing issues of systemic discrimination, et cetera. But at the same time, they need help. And there is a desperate need for more effective governance, for rule of law systems to be put into place, for impunity to be tackled, and obviously for there to be opportunity. And some reason for younger people, particularly in the countries that have the younger demographic picture, to have some degree of hope in their systems politically, but also for standards of living. Now, you know, what we know about classic economic development is that classic economic development, as important as it is, generates migration. So you cannot just say pour lots of money in to lots of projects and expect that that's going to have a cause and effect connection to outmigration. At the same time, frankly, that's not a reason not to do it. It has to happen over time. But we can't simply expect that that will lead to reduced migration pressures. So part of the discussion has to do with how do you target assistance from the outside, assuming that there is some real ownership on the part of the countries to change their futures, and at least have some more immediate. And by more immediate, I think it's fair to say we're talking 3 to 5 years, not 6 to 12 months. And longer term, it's 10 to 20 years. I mean, our experience with Mexico really beginning in a serious way in the 1990s for Mexico to have opened itself up to the rest of the world in its systems through NAFTA took until, as we said, the middle, you know, somewhere, you could date it back to like 2008, 2010, but more likely 2012, 2014, that the migration factors stabilized. And it wasn't simply the economy in Mexico changing, it was the fertility changing, it was the structure, the education systems, it was the recession in the United States, it was enforcement in the United States. It took all of those things coming together for the Mexican picture to change. So we have to take a long-term timeline view of development as a response. But we have to figure out, and frankly, I don't think anybody has the answers yet. I think we have to learn much more about this. What are the near-term, medium-term, and longer-term measures that actually make for effective investment of dollars in the development part of what must be part of this equation, but cannot be the singular response, because that is delusional.
Roberta,
Thank you, Robert. if we look what had happened in Europe in the last previous years in terms of the flows of refugees in the millions of people from Africa, from the Middle East, and to Europe. And when you read the newspapers and you see the reactions that took place in France, in Germany, in the UK, these phenomena of people living in masses seem to be taken by surprise, the countries in which they were going to. And in the case of Central America, we knew for many years ago that there was a gradual systemic system breaking down. And for us as Mexicans, we recognize we don't know enough about Central America being our neighbors. Not to say Washington, what does Washington understand of Central America, with all respect? And Central America comes from civil wars and from a very small economies that are very difficult to survive each other, that only joining together as a regional market could eventually have better possibilities for economic development. But there is a lot of politics and fights between the Central Americans and within the Central American countries, each one of them. And also from the US, when you talk about Latin America, you tend to say it's Latin America, as we tend to say it's Central America. No, it's Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and now Nicaragua, which are completely different. That we need to find a very specific analysis of what's going on. So what is new for the US and Mexico, as for the European Union dealing with all these refugee flows, is how do you attack these issues in the source countries, and how do you integrate these people to your societies? For Mexico, that's a huge change, because we have never been a receiving country of important flows of foreigners. Since we have statistics, only 1% of the population living in Mexico are foreigners, 1%, even today, with all the Americans that are living in Mexico now, it's not more than 1.5 million, all over, between Americans, Cubans, Spanish, whatever. So this will put Mexico to test in our society and our institutional capabilities to begin to host probably some thousands of refugees and probably some tens of thousands of Central Americans, which is completely new. And for Mexico and the US, not only to cooperate with each other, but to cooperate jointly to deal with the Central American issue is going to be for the first time ever. So that's why the issue is complex and has no easy solutions. What we know is that there is no solutions pretending just to deter and to control by force or by walls these flows of people. That won't take us anywhere.
Roberta then Andres.
Comprehensive solutions are exactly what we need to be looking for, but part of the problem and part of the reason that the investments in development or enforcement or governance in Central America are even harder than they might have been is frankly because the U.S. took its eye off the ball post-war in that region in Central America. There was lots of talk about peace dividends, and there were lots of cutbacks in assistance, and there were also lots of people demobilized and lots of weapons still in the region, and that's a fairly noxious combination. And the final thing I wanted to mention is when we talk about the way we have to jointly work with Central America and invest, if we can't push harder on the private sector in those countries to be part of the solution to this problem, it's never gonna result in sustainable solutions.
Agree with everything that's been said. There's another factor which has not been mentioned, and that is that geography plays an important role on the migration agenda. We talk as if we had monolithic Mexico and monolithic US, but that's not the case, because at the border, for example, border states on the Mexican side and on the US side at our northern border, and border states or border zones on the southern border of Mexico have very different views about how to deal with migration. President Lopez Obrador wants Mexico to be able to give more opportunities to its southern portion. And he has a series of infrastructure projects that he would like to undertake from Mexico City south. Nothing to the north of Mexico City, because the northern part of Mexico probably is developing at reasonably acceptable rates of development and growth. But the south is the part that holds Mexico back. And if we've talked about growth rates in Mexico over the last 10 years, they have been very moderate, mainly because the South doesn't grow at all. And so I agree with the idea that you have to bring development to the south of Mexico, and I think you also have to bring development to the northern triangle of Central America. But you have to also view this through the prism of the industrialized north of Mexico and areas in the United States where there is a job deficit and where people want immigrants to come and work. That's a very clear pull factor in the case of whether it's Central American migrants or Mexican migrants to come to the United States for jobs. We tend to categorize the Central American migration as a refugee, political refugee, and people escaping from violence. We don't have statistics. We need to know more about why these people are moving. I think that some of them are moving because they have families in the United States. The Salvadorians under TPS, Guatemalans and Hondurans and Mexicans. And the pull factor is my family is in the U.S. and I want to go and live with my family. The other pull factor, obviously, is this geographic distribution of job opportunities. And I think that people tend to mix these things up. So it's very difficult to say that a Central American coming from Salvador is necessarily escaping from the Mara Salvatrucha, or is necessarily escaping because he's being persecuted by his government. And these are I think, the stereotypes that we tend to create, just the way Mexicans traditionally and historically were stereotyped as people who were going to get jobs in the United States because the wage differential between the U.S. and Mexico was, and still is, by the way, 10 to 1. And so it's quite clear that people are going to be attracted to come to the U.S. if they can to get a job, because they'll be able to get more money and live better than they were living back home. All of these issues are things which MPI studies every day, and on which there's been an enormous amount of publication and work done, and academics have spent a lot of time and a lot of energy on it. But the governments don't tend to look at it that way.
And worse, talking about it, look at the range of options that we've talked about and phenomena that we've discussed, and yet the discussion between the Mexican and the U.S. government, let alone with other multilateral bodies or other nations, is conspicuous by its absence today. So that, in fact, all of this is well taken, but the fact is you need to have a plan and you need to have priorities, and none of that is actually taking place now, which is different from what used to be the case in terms of an ongoing policy dialogue between the two governments. We can't get to a developed Central America. We're going to need a generation for that. But the fact is that there are steps that we could be taking together, not only the ones we've talked about here, but dealing in Central America with the tremendous violence that afflicts people in communities there. So I think the question that was posed at the beginning, Claudia, is cooperation possible? It's not only is it possible because we've done it, but it's not taking place now. And one of the reasons is that we have polarization, not only between Mexico and the United States, but within the United States. that doesn't permit us to find the common ground and the middle way here.
I know Carlos wanted to say something, but I really want to open the floor for questions. So I'm sure you're going to have the opportunity to answer some. Before I start taking questions in order, I also remind people who are following the event on live stream that they can ask questions over Twitter or send it in the email. So I saw first this. Okay, let me just kind of figure out. I'm going to start here and then go back, and then I'm going to move to this side. If you can please introduce yourself really quickly.
Hi, my name is Joy Olson. Thank you for the panel. Thank you for the event. This has all been a very sane and calm and logical discussion, and I feel like this tremendous disconnect from current reality. That what we're living is chaos, and that that chaos on the policy side for the U.S. means that I think it's not a deterrent at all to Central America flows. It's making all of that even more dramatic. I can't figure out what Mexico's policy is right now either. So we're in this situation of chaos that I find really disturbing, and I'm trying to figure out what goes on over the next 2 years while I don't see an end to it. And I was just wondering if somebody could, comment on that.
Let's take a couple of questions before we move back to the panel. Yes. It was in the back. If you can stand up, please. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Alejandra Mijares. I grew up in Tijuana, and Tijuana received 3,000 Haitians, and people seem to have integrated well, and I still have family there, I still visit, and the rhetoric seems to be very different. How Haitian migrants are viewed are very hard workers, they came with money, and that's why it's different. But to me, it seems like there's more going on here, and I wondered if any qualitative studies are being done to understand what are the lessons learned there, what happened that's different. And my other just comment is that it seems like we can't talk about immigration without talking about climate change. If people are losing crops, and Honduras is 30% of the population works in agriculture, and they're losing their crops because of climate change, it seems like we need to talk about some of that in development. Thank you.
Here you in blue. I've seen lots of hands. She was first, I think, in the front.
Hi, I'm Anya Vilashak, and I would be very interested in hearing from the Mexican speakers what their assessment is of MPP, how it's received on the ground and by the government, by the population. I've heard it being described as a unilateral agreement, which is basically rejected by the government, but sort of tolerated because there is no way to resist it. And leaving for the moment aside what will be decided in U.S. courts, but I'd be interested in hearing.
The man over there goes on that direction now.
Hi, my name is Ryan Van Slyke, and thank you all for being here. I think one of the things, in addition to all of the options, at least, that you all talked about in terms of cooperation, that wasn't discussed was law enforcement and technical training in terms of how to counter gang activity, human smuggling, and human trafficking, both within the U.S. and in the Northern Triangle. And I know that HSI, which is Homeland Security Investigations, within the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, within DHS, works a lot with both Mexican law enforcement agencies and those within Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala to try to improve the capacities, at least, in terms of being able to do, in crime investigations, for example. So can you all attest to, or at least, what are your thoughts on that part of that cooperation and whether that may actually be more feasible because there's a shared interest between both Northern Triangle countries, Mexico, and the U.S.? Thank you.
Thank you. So just one question in the back, yep. And then we'll come back in the front.
We may have to squeeze in too. Hi, I'm David. I'm from Polaris. My question is similar to his, actually, in the sense that he's talking about a bottom-up. I want to hear you guys discuss a top-down. As leaders in the hemisphere, how do we hold the leaders of the Northern Triangle countries more accountable for their misconduct? And if you think about the last 9 presidents of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, some of them are in prison, them are under investigations for corruptions and other ties to criminal groups. How do we do a better job at holding them accountable?
Okay, so I'm going to bring the mic back. I'm going to ask all the people in the panel to be very quick because we do have another question. Carlos, if you can start by the first one you said you would address, and then we'll move on.
Actually, Joy talks about chaos and a major disconnect between what we've been addressing and the reality on the ground. Actually, the title of my notes is Major Disconnect. And I agree. I mean, the journalist Oscar Martinez says that in El Salvador they no longer use the verb to migrate. He says escapamos, huimos. We escape, we flee from our own country. And of course, the underlying hypothesis is that poverty drives people out. But if you count the number of ultra-rich in each country, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in El Salvador, then you see that it's much more an issue of enormous polarization. Because the oligarchies in those countries, and it addresses the issue of how do you hold the local oligarchies accountable, which is something that only the citizens of each country can do, but with external help. Then you find that it's a great business to export people and just stay within the paradigm of expel people so that they send remittances that are circulated through the shopping malls and then siphoned off some offshore bank. That's the vicious circle. We don't leave that vicious circle, we're going to get stuck in people trying to escape and flee from different kinds of violences, including the dry corridor and climate change. I'll stop here.
Andres, about MPP, please.
I think MPP, or if you want to put it another way, hidden safe third country policy is totally wrong. It's wrong to ask Mexico to take on these people that are applying for asylum because the U.S. doesn't have the ability to keep them either detained or in sufficient contact so that they can be followed during the year or 2 or 3 that it takes to go through their adjudication process. Safe third country was proposed to the previous administration in Mexico. It was accepted by the previous administration in Mexico at the outset in discreet discussions with the United States until the backlash came when it became public. And then they backtracked and said, no, we don't accept that. But since the U.S. had already announced it, then it became a unilateral United States decision to do it. And Mexico said, well, we don't agree with it, but we'll take these people for humanitarian reasons, which is absurd. There is no humanitarian aspect to taking these people in Mexico. If you see the way they are living today on the Mexican side of the border, there are not many of these asylum requestees who are on the Mexican side, but they are living in situations which are frankly subhuman. And the question is, are they going to live that way for 2 or 3 years? Because either that or they will integrate into the Mexican economy and the Mexican population. They'll drop their asylum requests into the U.S., or they will just sit there and wait for their asylum requests to be adjudicated. I understand that 97% of Central Americans who request asylum wait for their adjudication up until now. They don't disappear. And if that's the case, then it's even worse, because on the Mexican side, you have a border that is everything but safe. So to call it a safe third country to say that Mexico is a safe third country, I think is absurd. And the U.S. court in California has agreed that it is not a safe place. So I think, frankly, this is misguided policy on the part of Mexico, and it's misguided policy on the part of the United States.
Just to show that the way I think there's no short of the Mexican government cooperating by the stopping many of the migrants in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in the south, so that they don't make the unrestricted travel to the border. The only way in the short term, and I'm only talking about the short term, which is what I understood the Mexican government had agreed to, is that unless there is a deterrent to these flows coming in to exploit an asylum system that's overwhelmed, we should not be able to, we should not expect that the situation will change and that it will continue for years. Where I differ with the Mexican government is that they didn't demand anything in return for agreeing to conduct the MPP. That they didn't say to the Trump administration, okay, we'll cooperate in the spirit of co-managing this problem, but here's what you have to do. We need assistance. We need training of our people for refugee and asylum petitions. We need huge resource commitments so that people don't live in subhuman conditions. That's where I think, again, I'm not recommending this for the long term. I'm saying, how do we actually stop the surge that's occurring now? And I think MPP could play a role along with enforcement, but only if the Mexican government, if the Trump administration is willing to act as a true partner and deal with this in a cooperative fashion.
But that's the big if the U.S. administration is willing to cooperate. And in 2001, when we were trying to reach an agreement on migration between Mexico and the U.S. to have a more orderly, safe, legal way of moving between Mexico and the U.S., in those days, we also agreed that we wouldn't be able to do that if we don't share the responsibility in terms of putting each part something in the table. In that moment, there was the incentive for Mexico to fight trafficking, to cooperate at the border, to cooperate more actively in the border to stop the flow of drugs and the flow of illegal crossings, if and if only there was a legal way for Mexicans to come and go, either temporary or legalizing the undocumented population in Mexico. Those conversations in the US, those conversations were stopped when 9/11 happened. And since then until today, 17 years, we have been dealing with the same problems with no progress at all. And now we have to deal between the perceptions created by the White House and the realities in the field. And that's a tough one for you in the US society, and very tough for us in Mexico, because we cannot deal with these tweets all the time.
I do have a tweet that I want to read. Before going back to the two last questions and back to Roberta and Doris, who didn't answer in this round, there is a question from Monica Trigos that says, if there is no cooperation or change of narrative from governments, how can we involve other bilateral actors such as the private sector, civil society, media, and academia? So I'm going to go back to the last two questions.
I'm Jose with Reforma newspaper from Mexico. This is for the Mexicans. Can someone describe what's the internal debate within the Mexican government of what's happening on migration policy? I want to go back to Joyce's question. It seems total chaos, everybody contradicting itself. Either the Migration Institute, Foreign Relations, have the enforcement hawks won after the whole issue that happened in the past 2 weeks? What's happening inside?
From what I remember, there was a question in the middle, but I don't know if it was from you. No. Okay, last one, please. I've been very erratic.
Hi, good afternoon, Larry Kleinman. Thank you for this program. 12121. 650 days from now, the next administration takes office on 1/21/21. Is there one thing any of you would offer as the first step, with the assumption that not a whole lot will have changed and probably gotten worse from the reality we see today, that you would offer your piece of advice to the new United States administration and to the Mexican government in light of that administration change?
Okay, I'm going to take that as the last question because I feel like everybody will try to answer. And I think I would like to stay here until 6, but I have strict orders to finish in 8 minutes. So, and it's 7 of us in front, and I still need to say goodbye. So please, 1 minute each on whatever of the issues of the last round or things that were pending.
Let me address quickly.
So the problem is that you have well-meaning, dedicated officers in some respects in those police forces, and for the most part, working with HSI people trying to train them. But this is very incremental, and you've got institutions that are thoroughly corrupt, untrained, and not coordinated, not paid well enough. So this is a complete institutional redo that is going to be needed to build reliable law enforcement. There's no shortcut to that.
Roberta.
So I think I'll take the 1/21/21 question. The first thing both governments should do on the first day is commit to shared responsibility and working together to resolve the problem. And I would say that one of the first things the U.S. government should do is read Doris Meisner's piece with others. I should credit others in that group about how to accelerate and make much more flexible our asylum system so that we can begin to tackle what is clearly a root of desperation by people who should have other options to come to the United States, but at least we can start with that.
Doris.
Well, on the 1/21/21, I certainly would say we have to say to each other, the countries, reset, reset, reset. This has to start from a different point, and as we've all been saying, neither of our countries can deal with this issue unless we deal with it together. We have things we need to do individually and separately. Mexico has a very different agenda in many ways than the United States does in terms of what we need to do, but we have to be collaborative about it. And I would then say, from the U.S. standpoint, that I would hope if we do have new leadership, that there has to be an honesty with the American people about what these issues of migration really involve. There are not quick fixes. These are issues of managing the problem. They cannot simply be wiped away or solved in one sweeping motion. Shock and awe does not work. And so one would hope that the setting of expectations, but with real, measurable, and realistic progress along the way, is something that in a much more sober way we could start to inculcate into our own political debate.
Now, something we haven't had the chance to talk is just in terms of the differences between the short term, the long term, the medium term, and something that we talked a lot today in terms of integration and just how to deal in the long term with all these populations has been missing in terms of cooperation. And I would think, I mean, it's a pity. We did discuss a lot on how to cooperate in terms of integration and in terms of welcoming migrants in the long run as citizens and that will live here forever because they have created families and because they have created ties. And when we talk about the undocumented population, we see that, I mean, most of them have been here for more than 15 years, and not only for Mexicans, but from all over the world. So I guess I will start to conclude. I don't know if anyone has a very quick comment to make, like a 10-second comment in terms of what was pending. No? I really appreciate everyone for being here, and I thank you for being in the audience, for following the event. I really thank the panel. I didn't introduce you. Everyone has the bios in the chairs, but I really thank Carlos Heredia, Doris Meissner, Gustavo Moar, Alan Bersin, Roberta Jacobson, and Andres Rosenthal for this very stimulating discussion. And I'm sure that if you would organize a 3-hour panel, we would still be here. But thank you very much, and I really hope that we follow up this discussion. Few announcements. Please visit migrationpolicy.org for more resources and to view the related report to the video. I would add, please visit migdep.colmex.mx, which is a seminar on migration, inequality, and public policy that we coordinate in Mexico that has lots of resources on migration. And I mean, we have lots of resources if you're interested in migration, so please do check them out. There are also other MPI publications available in the hallway, and I would please ask you to give everyone a big round of applause for all the questions that we didn't have time to answer.